Hey, what's up everybody? It's David Ariev here again for Eyedesyn.com for another crazy awesome Octane tutorial. Today we're going to be creating complex shaders inside of Octane, and what I mean by that is like anisotropic metal materials, some dust shaders as like a film over top of your materials. We're going to be creating some glass and then some grungy gold. So all of those should be really crazy and fun, a little bit more advanced than usual today, so let's jump in and do it. Cool, so let's take a look at a couple of these shaders we're going to be making today. This is the dust shader, and it's interesting because it only accumulates on these kind of more flat facing surfaces, so when the slope gets high enough like around here, you don't see the dust anymore. So it's kind of this film that sits over top of the material and behaves in a kind of realistic manner, and it also like occludes this glass, so it's kind of neat that you can see through this glass. But then, you know, the dust kind of covers that up. And then the other interesting thing I'd like to point out is that it also exists in these cracks and crevices and on the edges. And if you take a look as I play this, this brown one I think is actually a little bit more realistic than the pink one. I was having some issues with this one, and if you look at like the specular highlights, for instance, they never actually get obscured or affected by the dust. So this one kind of feels like there's dust and then there's been like a layer of clear coat over top of it. So that's not exactly what we want in this case. But if you look here, you can see as these kind of reflections pass underneath the dust, they get totally obscured. So this feels more like a layer on top versus just something that's been laminated over top of. Alright, and this is that grungy gold shader I was talking about. I developed this for a recent project and it took some time to figure out, but I like that there are all these dents and there are some areas that really catch the light and others that don't, so it feels like there's a nice variation in scale and in terms of the quality of the surface. But the real place we're going to start today is with Anisotropic Materials, and let me present to you some overly dramatic pots. We're going to be recreating this whole scene today for starters, but if you take a look on the left, this is using an older version of Octane where I've kind of manually built this anisotropic shader, and you can see it looks more like a brushed metal. But on the right here we have, from the new version of Octane 3.08, a perfect anisotropic material where you don't actually see the brushed metal nature of it. So let's jump in and recreate all of this madness. Alright, so I got some kind of HDRI sitting here of a church, but that really doesn't matter. Choose whichever HDRI you like. But the first thing to do is we're going to come over here to the content browser and enter in pot. And then there we go, we got some pots. Let's drop in this dude here. And then the first thing we want to do is convert these materials to Octane, because obviously it looks terrible. So let's grab these and go to Material, Convert Materials, and then Material, Remove Unused Materials. So now we are all Octane materials. Alright, well that didn't stop it from looking terrible, but let's ignore the lid for the time being because that's glass and we're going to do a whole section on glass. So let's just come into this material here, which is the metal, and let's make sure it's fully black on the diffuse, which is good. Then we want the index to be much higher and the specular to be also much higher. Let's make this white. There we go. Now we've got a metal material going on. And one thing you'll notice, if we take the roughness all the way down, these reflections are not exactly what you'd expect of stainless steel because they're not stretched vertically. So it's not yet an anisotropic material. So let me first show you the old model of doing this, which actually has its own benefits and allows you to achieve more of a brushed metal look. So if we go to the Octane node editor here, we can drop in an Octane Noise and add that to the bump. And basically all of this stretchy highlight action happens in the bump. So what we can do is just add in a UVW transform and come in here to the scale and untick lock aspect ratio. And then on the X scale, we can just take this way down until we start to see this repeat over and over again, and we'll just keep on going. And you can see what starts to happen is we get these kind of brushed metal looking strokes. Now the issue is the effect is way too strong right now, so we can basically mix this effect down with a multiply node. So if we just drop this on this wire here, that'll add this in. And what the multiply is doing, just like in After Effects, when we add in a value less than 1, it darkens or reduces the effect of whatever we've got. So here we're going to add in a float texture, and that's basically just any value between 0 and 1, black and white. and it defaults to 0.5. So here we've got half of the effect. So it's kind of like a mix slider. So as we take this down to lesser and lesser values, it's multiplying this number by our previous noise. So we're basically just mixing it down. So you can see now we're getting a much nicer brushed metal kind of look. I think we can transform this even lower to see a better result here. So that's starting to look kind of cool. It looks a little too uniform, so I find if I bring up the omega, we can get a little bit more variation in there. So I'll kind of do a before and after here. So let's go compare store render buffer, and then I will up the omega so you can see now we've got a lot more variation in our texture. So if we want to go even further with this, we can take this even smaller. And at some point, if we don't want to see the brushed metal texture, we just need to start adding in zeros. So let's just add in a 0 there, and we'll take it even further, one more 0, to the point where we can no longer really see that brushed metal look. And now if we mix this down even further, you can see if we take it too far, we'll just be back to our original, but just go up even a little bit, and it'll really start to blur out the reflections. Alright, let's duplicate our pot here so we can compare to the new model of Anisotropic Materials with Octane 3.08. If we come over here under Materials, we've got this new Octane Metal material, and we can just twirl this down and replace our old metal materials here. And when we come to the index, we see something new. We've got these two values of N and K. So N is the index of refraction as it was before, though now we've got some kind of slight difference. So before, when we created a metal material with a normal octane glossy material, say we go here and we take the diffuse down to black like we did before, our index was somewhat different. So if you take a look, the material darkens until we hit a perfect 1, and then it becomes a mirror-like surface. So this is the brightest and most reflective the material could be, even more so than 8. So if I go compare store render buffer and I take our index of refraction all the way up to 8, you'll see that 8 is slightly darker even than 1, which is a perfect mirror surface. So that's kind of the normal index of refraction that we're used to. But now with this new metal material model, if I untick my compare mode here, you'll see that as I come closer to 1, it's just the same as it was, but then it comes back slowly to a mirror-like surface. So we go from mirror all the way down to 1, and then it gets dark. And then we come back the other way, and it gets bright, just like it did before, up to 8. So it's a little bit different, so that can be a little confusing, but this is basically the index of refraction. So now the new thing is this K value, which stands for the Extinction Coefficient, and it basically is similar to an absorption, so how far light can pass through the substance before it gets absorbed. So as we bring this up, this will actually increase the brightness of the metal further. So these are complex indexes of refraction, and it's just a more accurate model than what we had before, and it's super easy to look up these numbers. On refractiveindex.info, you can just type in whatever kind of metal you want, and then you'll get specific numbers for both of these values. So you'll get something that matches whatever metal you're looking up much more accurately. So that's cool. And I also think it has a little more to do with the Fresnel properties and how these metals fall off on the edges as well. Okay, that aside, we've also now got this fancy new tab for anisotropy. So if we come over here, you'd expect this slider to do something, but it doesn't. And I found that that doesn't work until you come over to the basic tab, and under your BRDF model, you have to change it to something other than octane. See here, if we go to the roughness and increase this, we'll see kind of our standard blurring. But now if we come back and go to Beckman, you'll see that this will just start to blur on one axis. And right now it's just doing a horizontal axis, so we'll have to fix that. And also let's take the anisotropy up to 1. So there we go. Now we can see it just streaking horizontally. Now there's a tab for rotation, and here we're going to add in a C40 octane float texture. So again, just a value between 0 and 1, and I found that here you can see as we go. At some point it snaps into alignment, and now we've got some perfect anisotropy. But I think the value that we'll want is 0.25. 0.75 also works just as well. So now we've rotated it 90 degrees. And if we kind of fly in here, you'll see that we can get super close to this material and never see any lines. Whereas before, the difference is if we come close enough, we will see those little individual scratches. And that's actually physically accurate, that, you know, these striations in a material will cause the highlights and reflections to blur out vertically. So pick whichever you want. I think this one's like a pretty sweet shortcut, but here we can actually get some more complex brushed metal look. So if we go back again, we can take our transform back up. So let's delete some of these zeros and we'll get more of a brushed metal look. And maybe we take this multiply node back a little bit until the effect is a little more strong. So I think this is an interesting alternative here where you can actually see the brushed metal. Alright, so let's bring back our lids here and check out what's going on. So this glass material is obviously way too rough. Let's bring that down. And then let's go to our index and make sure, I don't know, let's go around 1.5 or so. But let's lift this up and see what's going on with the lid itself. So let's grab this one and bring this up. And it's still a little too rough, so let's bring that further down until we can kind of see what's happening. So this doesn't look very semi-transparent to me. It's overly reflective. And when I mess with the index, nothing really looks like it's happening until we hit rock bottom here. So it's just behaving really weirdly, and this is a problem that you'll run into a lot with Octane and glass materials, is you have to be really conscious of the way the normals are facing. So on this lathe object here, we've got a flip normals, and that is going to essentially fix our problem. So let's turn fake shadows on, which helps speed up the calculations in almost all cases. And you can see now the index is actually affecting the image, but now we're overly transparent, and the issue is that the reflection is set to this gray value. So let's bring it all the way up to white, and there we go. Now we're actually seeing some reflections, and we're seeing some semi-transparency. So this looks a lot more like glass now. So it's a simple fix, but something to be aware of. And if you had this issue with something that had already been made editable, all you would have to do is go and select all your polygons and hit U/R to reverse the normals, and then you're back to a normal looking glass. Alright, so I've popped these lids back into place. They're looking a lot more normal now. Let's go and make the floor and turn this into a render with overly dramatic pots. Alright, so first let's create a plane and just drop this down so that it's no longer intersecting. So something like that. And let's try to make this studio setup where it kind of feels like an infinite floor. So what I can do is just create a new Octane material here. Let's just create a diffuse, and let's kind of go back here so we can see what's going on. And let's jump into our node editor here. And what I'm going to do is just pull a gradient texture in. So not Octane's gradient, but Cinema 4D's gradient works way better with this. So I'll pull in, these are all the Cinema 4D shaders here. So I'm pulling in this gradient, and I'm going to pipe it into the opacity slot here. So we could try a circular gradient, and you can see that's causing the center to be semi-transparent and then the edges to be opaque. So we can just right click and invert knots, and if we go back here, you'll see what's going on. So we want to kind of crunch this in and then bring this one up so it's clipping to white, and we're not seeing any edges, so that's good. But earlier I was doing some tests and I actually found that linear created a bit of a smoother fall off, so we can do that. And then we can just rotate this plane 90 degrees. So something like that should work. And then let's scooch this over so that these pots are actually on a fully opaque section. So I'm doing this so I can create a separation between this plane's texture and the eventual sweep that I'm going to put right here. So let's actually just go ahead and make that sweep. So if I grab this plane and duplicate it, I can just kind of scoot it back here. And this one, I don't need the gradient, so let's just put a regular diffuse texture on there. And then let's drop in a bend deformer. If I hold shift when I click it, it'll become a child of it immediately. And then I want to increase the strength so I can see what axis it's bending on, and let's try rotating it 90 degrees. This is the bend deformer dance, and 90 degrees again. That looks pretty close. Let's keep going. 90, holding down shift, that's correct. So now if we fit to parent, we get a smooth curve, and then I'm just going to increase the size of the plane here, scoot it back more, and the bend deformer can come this way, and then I'll give the plane more height segments so that it bends a little bit more smoothly, and then let's up the strength here. Cool, so something like that. So now these two pieces can be separate. You can see one will, when I scooch this down, one will kind of blend into the other here. So, but we don't want these pots to be on a semi-transparent section, so I think I screwed that up a little bit earlier. Let's scooch this. I may have hit undo. So there we go. So now this is blending into this. Let's maybe move this back a little bit so it's not actually intersecting. There we go. So that's more what I'm looking for. Okay, let's go back to our original angle by hitting Control-Shift-Z a bunch of times. So that undoes the view on the camera. And now you can see we can create two different textures. So this one could be dark and the other one bright, and there will be some kind of fall off. And the only thing bugging me at this point is this hard line. So if I come back into this texture, I can kind of crunch this gradient in a bit more, and then at some point I think we start to see more of a feathered look. So that's kind of what I'm after here. Okay, for starters, to create more of a uniform look, I can go to these two colors and tie them together. So if I go to my diffuse color here, I can right click and go to Expressions, Set Driver, and then come to this material here, which is this guy, and go to Expressions, Set Driven Absolute. So now they'll just be the same color, so I can come back here and, you know, change this to a brighter color, and it'll update. Sometimes it gets a little finicky unless I go a frame forward, and then it updates. So maybe we'll start with a white cyc here. And let's clean things up a bit. I'm going to go to Materials, remove Unused Materials. So that guy, some of those were unnecessary. But I know I want this to be a reflective floor, so let's come in to our floor here and change the type to glossy. So if we come to diffuse here, change it to glossy, and now we're picking up some reflections. And then let's also take the color back down, because that helps floors look even more reflective. And then that should also affect the back wall. Okay, now here's something interesting. I'm going to turn off this back sweep. You can see how much that's blocking the reflections of the HDRI in the background. So a lot of the time I like to separate out my environment into a visible environment that's more of a backplate, or just one that's creating reflections, another that's more of a general ambient light, and then also combine the daylight system. So you can actually combine all three of those things in Octane. So right now this is a primary environment, so it's both creating the backplate and it's casting light and reflections. But we could create another Octane environment, so we would go under Objects, Texture Environment. So I've got a button for that here, and I could just click on this, and it would overwrite the previous one because A, it's a primary environment, and B, it is above the previous one. So if I put this below, then the previous HDRI would take effect. So let's put this above, but instead let's change it to a visible environment. So right now it's just acting as a backplate. So whatever color I change this to is what our background color is going to be. But I actually want the reverse of this situation. So let's make this a primary environment, so it's casting light and causing all the reflections, and then turn this one into a visible environment. And now we get backplate reflections and refractions tick boxes. So interestingly, this is still affecting the light. So if I brought this way down, we would get much more crushed shadows, or we could bring it up and give it some kind of tint, and then we'd be introducing a bit of red into the scene. So if I bring my plane back here, you can see how this is affecting the scene. So it's kind of a cool control to have. And often I just set it to white and then mess around with it when I feel like introducing some color. So the third thing we can add in is the sunlight. And if I add that in here, it will overwrite the primary environment. So you can see that this one, this is our primary environment, no longer has an effect. But interestingly, we kept the reflections from our HDRI. So if I were to turn off this HDRI that had the backplate reflections and refractions ticked, you'd see now we're just getting the reflections from the sunlight. So I'm going to keep the HDRI reflections, and I can rotate this around and get some more hard-ish shadows. And if I want to soften those up, I can come to my daylight and just increase the sun size to something like that. So that's a little bit nicer. And then if I want to combine this with these other two HDRIs, I can come in and I can tick Mix Sky Texture. So now this will actually affect things. So we could have it be a kind of greenish color cast, this is affecting things, and this one is also affecting things. So pretty cool. This gives us a lot of control over the lighting. I'm going to take this back to white for the time being. Okay, real quick, this was bugging me. So do you see these kind of ugly striations on the handles? This is due to improper mapping. It's all set to UV right now. So if we go to our self-made anisotropic material here, come in here and go to our noise, we can click the button for projection. And right now it's set to mesh UV. So if we go to box, it's going to mess things up temporarily. So what we want to do is let's go to transform and let's pinch this down even further so we can see what's going on. Right now it looks like the bumps are going in the wrong direction. So what we can do is we can rotate them on Z. So let's go to -90, I think, which makes sense. Let's go -90, and there we go. So now we're getting our pretty stripes back, and you can see that this has fixed these handles, and it's also fixed these handles because I think I forgot to replace these materials with the one here, but that doesn't matter. Looks a lot better now to me. All right, now let's take a look at how some simple camera adjustments and a couple lights can dramatically alter the scene. So let's hop inside this camera here and enable our camera imager. And the new default profile is sRGB, which is cool, but I like, for whatever reason, this Ektachrome 400 XCD, though it looks terrible at first usually, so I'm gonna click neutral response, and that helps a little bit. And it's too crunchy to begin with, so I'm gonna increase the gamma so it brightens a little bit and decrease the exposure. So play with these two values until I get something a little bit nicer. So that's kind of a before and after. It's just adding in a lot of contrast really. And if it's blowing out the highlights too much, there's also a highlight compression slider that can kind of reel them in a little bit. So that's kind of nice. Next, I'm just going to create a light with a sphere. So I'm just going to literally drop in a sphere and I'll scale it down, bring it up here, make it pretty small, kind of scoot it back a little bit, and I'm going to give it some more segments until it's smooth looking, and then I'm going to right click and go to C4D Octane tags and then an Octane object tag, and here I'm going to come to visibility and turn off camera visibility. Then I'm going to create a new diffuse material and drop it on there and jump into here and do the old black body emission. So there's a black body emission, and then in my Octane camera settings I can come over to post-processing, enable the bloom, and just kind of bring up some bloom here so it looks more like a light bouncing off of this. But here's the thing I've been doing recently quite a bit. So if I go to my black body emission, under the texture I can add in a C4D Octane Gaussian spectrum, and then I'll jump into this real quick and just bring the wavelength all the way this way and the width all the way down. The width is really what's controlling how saturated this is. So this is a really good way to make very intense like neon lights, though at some point it gets kind of really ugly in there. And the way you can fix this is by coming to the camera imager and going to the saturate to white control and bringing that up, and you can see immediately that creates a white hot highlight and then that rim of neon light. So let's mess with the shape of our sphere. Let's kind of let's hit C to make it editable and maybe stretch it out a little bit so that we get that kind of deal going on. And we can kind of play with where it's falling. And then I'll come back into this black body emission here, into the Gaussian spectrum, and you can just tweak the wavelength and get all these different kinds of interesting colors. So you could get like a red, or if you come this way, you can easily get a purple, and also play with the width. I think I'll bring the width out a little bit. Okay, maybe I'll take the wavelength all the way this way and then mess with this until I get some kind of blue like that. I kind of like this because it's this weird combo between kind of this cyan and this almost purple. And then I can come back to my post-processing and up the bloom a little bit more maybe. Okay, now check this out with a glare. If I increase this, I start to get this terrible glare. But what I can do is bring this amount down to 1. And then I can change the angle to -90, and now we've got basically horizontal lens flares, which is the same profile as an anamorphic lens flare, and then I can increase the blur so that it looks a lot more subtle. And sometimes I like to play around with these controls as well. Spectral intensity will get you almost a chromatic aberration, and the more you increase this, the more the effect, and then this one will just obviously shift the colors of the effect, though in this case I'm really not liking what's going on, so I'm going to keep that off. Now let's duplicate our sphere across and find another spot for this one. I think that works okay. Now, if the image is getting a little too purplish, we could come into our camera imager and adjust against that here. And one thing I'm noticing is that I forgot to turn off the daylight, so things are going to get a lot more dramatic when I do that, and maybe too much in this case. So I think I want to adjust these lights a little bit more. So let's jump in here and start messing around with these values. Take the power way down, and maybe somewhere around here, though even less on the power. And then maybe we take down the glare is a little too much at this point. So make that a little more subtle there. And then also we can stretch out these spheres to cover a little more of the area of the top of these pots here. So I kind of like that longer highlight a little bit better. Something like that. And I'll just keep tweaking a little bit more. I'm liking that a bit more. We can really get these crazy neon colors this way. But I think I'm going to stick with the blue. Sci-fi pots. Cool, and here's a tool that I've started using a lot. You can see that this section of the image is pretty noisy. So I like to turn on the region render and then just put it over top of that and see how long it takes to refine that part of the image. So it's kind of hard to see, but right now it's at about 3,000 samples and it looks relatively clean. So you can kind of come around here and be like, okay, maybe I need around 2,000 samples for this image to really clean up. And this is pretty dang subtle, but there's a bit of a weird rim along the bottom of this pot. And whenever there are issues with light penetrations that come to really small points or weird artifacts, I always jump to ray epsilon and see if that's the issue. So I'm going to go to my Octane settings and undock this here. And if I just kind of tweak my ray epsilon down, you should see it start to vanish. So at that point, we're no longer getting this issue here. So the smaller you make this ray epsilon value, essentially the more accurate the light penetrations can be calculated. But at some point you can go too far with it, and in big scenes that can create pretty awful artifacts. So sometimes you need to decrease the slider, sometimes you need to increase it, but just be aware that it's there. Cool, I'm gonna go ahead and make that wet floor. There are a bunch of tutorials already out on wet floors, but this is the method that worked best for me and that I found to be the simplest. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So I'm going to right click and select this material here. Alright, so here's my floor material. The super easy cop-out way to do this that I often use is just take an image texture and pipe it into the roughness, and then we'll come in here and grab something like, let's look around. Something like this material here. I'll open this so you can see which it is. So that might work. Just any kind of grunge map. And let's now hit UV transform and up the scale. And let's scale it up even more. And maybe let's invert it. So that's looking a little bit better. It's got some areas that are more reflective than others. So this basically just creates a difference of the blurriness of the reflection across the surface. So some areas feel like they're way more shiny and reflective, and others feel more matte. And then we could increase this further with a gradient. Just drop a gradient in there, and we could kind of crunch this down. And make it feel like there are pools of wetness. So this is the easy version. And we could also take this white point and bring it down if we want it to be even more subtle. So this is more like a wet floor on the whole, but then there are a few spots that kind of poke out that are less wet. But I'm going to ditch this idea entirely because I want to do it a little bit better, and this is, after all, a tutorial on complex shaders in Octane. So I know right off the bat that this is going to be a mixed material because I want to mix between two kinds of concrete floor, one that's really bumpy and a little more dry, and then the other one that's the wet version of that concrete floor. So I could just take this material and duplicate it here by holding down Control, And then since we're using the same gradient on both, I can just pipe this into the opacity on that one, and this can control both at the same time. And now let's grab a mixed material and drop it down here and pipe both of these into material 1 and material 2. Okay, we're not seeing any change because we have to actually drop the mixed material on there. So let's grab this mixed material and drop it on our floor here. And also we're going to need to actually change one of these two materials in order to see a difference. So let's make this one be our kind of rough surface. So for now, let's just increase the roughness. And now we can see if we slide this slider one way, we'll get a totally reflective surface, and slide the other way and we'll get a much more matte surface or much more blurry reflection. But we want to modulate between these two with a texture. So let's jump in here and add another texture for the amount. Now in this case, I don't think I actually want to use a texture. I want to just use a noise. So let's drop that in there and let's go to the amount right there. And we're not going to see much of a difference until we drop in a gradient and really crunch this down. So let's put a gradient here. And let's kind of crush this until we see, there we go. Now we're getting some pools of water and no water. And let's click on our UVW transform here and maybe make it a little smaller. So I'm liking that look a little bit better. If we go into the noise and increase the octaves, we'll get a little bit more of a complex edge as well as the omega. Though at that point, I think it actually gets a little too crunchy and just starts looking kind of grungy. So maybe we were actually better off with a simpler noise. And if we really want the distinction between these pools to be well defined, we could, let's go compare store render buffer. And then here we could increase the contrast of this noise. And we'll begin to see that these sharpen up a whole lot. But I don't necessarily like that in this case. I kind of like having a bit of a softer edge, so I'm going to undo that. All right, so now let's actually get a concrete texture in here. So I'm going to drop in image texture and link it up to both of these diffuse slots. And now let's come and find, I've got my textures folder here, Polygon. So polygon.com is what I use for the majority of my textures. And I'm going to scroll down to concrete. Actually, it's this chip paint that I'm going to use. So let's grab this one. Cool, and let's UV transform and scale this down. So maybe something like that. And for it to look a little more reflective, I'm going to take the brightness down. So just reduce the power here. Okay, and actually I'm going to want to be able to control the brightness of the watery sections and the normal sections differently. So if I create a separate copy of this texture here and link it up to this diffuse, that's more what I want. But I still want to be able to transform both of them at once. So I'll link both of these up to the transform here. So now I can actually boost the power of just this section here, or vice versa. So that just gives me a little bit more control to tweak, but I'm going to leave it the same for now. Cool, and what really sells this effect is adding in a normal map to the sections that are supposed to be dry. So let's just duplicate this again, hold down Control, add in the same transform so that they're all identical, and here we're going to hit our little ellipsis and then look for Chip Paint 04, because that's the same one, and we'll come down to the normal map. And here we want to make sure the power is back at 1, and then let's load this into our normal slot. And we could even boost this super high to like 4. And now you can see we get a really bumpy surface here and a really smooth surface in the areas where we see puddles. All right, I think it might help to pitch the camera up a little bit so we can see these puddles a little bit better. I think that's a bit more interesting and we can kind of see what's going on. And I think that maybe this section is a little too rough. So if we come back here to our roughness, the normal map is actually doing a lot of that work for us. So if we bring this back down, even all the way down to 0, we're going to see that the normal map is causing that reflection to break up. And we're seeing a lot more blurriness in that reflection because of the normal map. So even just a little bit of roughness, I think, would go a long way, and it would look a little more interesting on the whole. And a couple other factors we could play with real quick. If you want to see, let's go compare store render buffer. If we went back to 1 on the normal map, we would be looking like this. So it's a little bit of a smoother surface. So that's up to you. I kind of liked that extra grungy surface, so I'm going to take that back to 4. And then the other thing I might want to see is if the areas that are out of the water are a little bit less shiny. So we could come up here and just take our specular down. So that's making a pretty big difference, but I don't like losing all these highlights in here, so maybe I'll just split the difference. Cool, I'll go with that. And you can always come back to your transform and mess with the number of puddles, so you can make them smaller. You can also take your gradient here and crunch these down even more. So let's go compare store render buffer and really make this a tight puddle, so you can see what that looks like. We could also, as we come this way, we're going to create smaller pockets of water, and then come the other way and we'll create a whole lot more water. I'm going to undo and go back to slightly larger scale, somewhere around there. And lastly, we could try and create some little ripples in the water. So we could do that in the bump channel of the water material, which is this guy. So if we try and create another noise, or maybe let's try a turbulence here. Let's go to pipe that into the bump. You can see that that's already breaking up the water surface. Now if we want to see what this looks like, we can right click and go solo node, which is a new feature. And sometimes you have to go 1 frame forward for it to work. So solo node, and then if we add in a gradient, we can kind of crunch this down. So let's go gradient, and to unsolo this, you have to right click in this blank area and say disable solo. You can also right click, and now you can disable nodes individually, which is great. So let's enable that back. And now if I right click and solo this guy, we're going to see this one and this one together. And I'll move 1 frame forward. So we get this kind of weird view, but as I adjust this, we can actually see pretty clearly what's happening to our noise texture and what that noise texture actually looks like. So right now we've got pretty big splotches, so we could try using a UV transform, and then maybe we stretch these out somewhat to make it more like these horizontal ripples, though that may or may not work. Let's check it out. Let's disable this, and it's going to look weird for a second. Let's move 1 frame forward. There we go. So that's looking too digital to me, so let's actually go back to what we had before, and I kind of liked this broken up warbly surface. Okay, and let's solo this one more time. So if I right click and go solo node, we can see what's going on. So just to check our controls, the octaves increases the detail, and then the omega increases kind of the intensity. So those two controls we can just be thinking about. And now let's disable the solo mode and go 1 frame forward so that we kind of reset this. There we go. The last little control I want to put in here is that multiply trick. So if we drag in a multiply and then we drag in a float, we can essentially mix down the effect. So if we take this all the way down to 0, and we can just kind of, for reference, go compare store render buffer. And now if we just bring this up a little bit, you'll start to see these reflections distorting. So we can kind of dial this in a little bit. Maybe we just want a slight bend, and maybe we want a little bit more detail there, so it's a little more ripply, and so that looks a lot more like kind of turbulent water. And from there, maybe we take this effect down even more. So it's just affecting the water slightly. Cool, so from here, keep in mind we can get a totally different look by altering these colors here. So say we want some kind of purpley hues going on. We can add that in. And then we can also turn on the daylight. We can mix up and down the daylight. So maybe that's too intense. We can bring that in. So this is kind of a more glossy look, though we're losing the puddles a bit. So we can kind of rotate around this daylight until we get something more interesting. And often the sun color kind of interferes. So you could intentionally control the sun color and make it something crazy. Or you could just strip the color out and then we'll have a more neutral scene. Play with the gamma. So that could be a cool look in and of itself. And here's another fun tip for you guys. So if we go and search for Nick Scarcella Instagram, this is one of my online buddies, Nick, and he's been making these amazing HDRIs in Times Square and other places in New York City at night. I really like these stylistic HDRIs. So if you copy this, it's in his Gumroad and it's free. So there you go, $0. It's called Manhattan Nights, and you get all these interesting HDRIs. So I'm going to load one of these in there. Let's duplicate this, get rid of our link tag there. Okay, and then I'm going to go navigate over here and find Manhattan Nights. And let's try one of these Broadway Lafayette Station ones. And let's turn off the sun so we can see this a lot better and boost the power. So now we're getting some crazy rainbow colors. So if you want rainbow pots, this is definitely the way to go. Let's try one more. Let's go with one of these Times Square ones. So that's kind of an interesting look right here. Okay, let's try one more. Let's go for this 49th Street one here. And let's come back up and maybe rotate it around. We can also go to UV transform if it's too stripy, and we could just kind of scale it up and get something totally different that way. And maybe if that's blowing out too much, we could drop our exposure a little bit and boost our gamma. So I think that's kind of fun. You can get all sorts of stylistic looks with these HDRIs. And it's good to combine actual lights with HDRIs. All right, one more tweak. I found this a little bit more interesting. I just rotated it on Y and ended up with this. And just for funsies, let's look at some of the other renders that I created along the way. So these were some of my first ones where I had a layer of grunge over top as well, but I'll show you how to do that in the dust shader section. Here's one of the rainbowy ones, more brightly lit. And then this is where things started getting dramatic. This was my previous one I made earlier today. Pretty similar to where we ended up just now. And this was with an additional sunlight pouring in and changing that ambient color on the texture environment to more of a red. Alright, that should do it for part 1, but make sure to check out part 2, which will include all of that dust shader madness as well as the grungy gold material.